American political discourse underwent an unexpected development in recent years. The critiques of institutional power no longer originate from traditional left-wing circles, but rather from an ideologically diverse coalition of the tech-right, conservative populists, and heterodox thinkers. At the center of this intellectual shift stands James Burnham, a mid-20th century political theorist whose once marginal ideas have acquired new relevance in our era of bureaucratic overreach and elite consolidation. Contemporary populist movements have intuitively grasped what Burnham systematically analyzed, that modern governance has become dominated by a self-perpetuating class of managers who operate across government, corporations, and cultural institutions. Tucker Carlson's relentless attacks on the ruling class and Steve Bannon's war against the administrative state represent popularized versions of Burnham's core thesis, that real power increasingly resides not with elected officials, but with permanent bureaucracies, credentialed experts, and networked elites. This populist critique has achieved particular prominence as traditional left-right divisions give way to a more fundamental tension between institutional insiders and outsiders. The working-class voters abandoning progressive parties in both America and Europe appear to be responding to what Burnham identified decades ago, that managerial elites, whether in government or corporations, have developed shared interests and values that often diverge from those they ostensibly serve. Parallel to this political revolt, parts of Silicon Valley has shown interest for Burnham's ideas. The tech world's growing disillusionment with progressive governance models, visible in Marc Andreessen's critiques of regulatory overreach and Curtis Yarvin's radical anti-establishment writings, demonstrates how Burnham's framework transcends traditional political categories. Andreessen's advocacy for entrepreneurial disruption over bureaucratic stagnation echoes Burnham's warnings about how managerial classes tend toward risk aversion and institutional preservation. Meanwhile, Yarvin's characterization of progressive consensus as a cathedral of elite opinion updates Burnham's analysis for the digital age, where algorithmic governance and platform censorship have created new mechanisms of elite control. To examine the mechanisms of power more precisely, we take a closer look at Burnham's 1943 foundational work, The Machiavellians, Defenders of Freedom. Burnham begins the study of power by discussing Machiavelli's discourse on the meaning of language in politics. Political language is rarely concerned with truth or morality in any objective sense, rather it functions as a tool to legitimize power. This becomes evident when examining the duality between formal and real meaning in political discourse. Formal meanings are rooted in metaphysical or idealistic concepts, divine right, morality, liberty, or progress, while real meanings reflect the concrete power dynamics and material interests that drive political action. Public discourse, particularly as mediated by the press and popular debate, is saturated with formal goals, obscuring the underlying realities of politics. When debates revolve around abstract ideals rather than tangible conflicts, the populace becomes incapable of recognizing, much less pursuing, its own interests. Worse still, the dominance of formal meanings renders a true science of politics impossible, as idealistic rhetoric cannot accurately describe the conditions that produce political outcomes. This tension between appearance and reality is not new. The French Revolution, for instance, was in real terms a revolt by the emerging capitalist class against the feudal aristocracy, yet it was justified through the lofty ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Similarly, European colonialism framed itself as a civilizing mission, the white man's burden, while its real meaning was economic exploitation and imperial domination. These historical examples demonstrate how political actors use formal meanings to mask their true objectives, a dynamic that persists in modern discourse. For Machiavelli, history is not a linear march of progress, but an endless cycle of rise and decline. All states, no matter how prosperous or well-ordered, eventually succumb to corruption and decay. This cyclical view is captured in the saying, "Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times." The cycle is unbreakable because it is rooted in human nature itself. Our inherent struggle for power ensures that no political order lasts forever. Yet Machiavelli does not advocate resignation. Instead, he emphasizes the necessity of institutional structures that channel conflict productively. His ideal regime is a mixed constitution, blending monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements to ensure that no single class dominates entirely. Political liberty, in his view, emerges not from forced unity, but from the controlled tension between competing interests. Only when all classes are represented can oppression be minimized and stability maintained. His ideas remain strikingly relevant today, particularly in periods of elite transition, just as he wrote during the shift from feudalism to capitalism. Where a rising bourgeois class displaced the old aristocracy, we now witness new counter-elites, tech oligarchs and bureaucratic managers, challenging the established capitalist order. Unsurprisingly, Machiavellian analysis resurfaces during power struggles, world wars, the Cold War, and now in an era of institutional decay and reconfiguration. Mosca's political theory is rooted in a fundamental rejection of monistic explanations of history. Unlike deterministic theories that attribute historical development to a single factor, whether ethnicity, economic interest, or geography, Mosca argues that history emerges from the complex interplay of multiple forces. Cultural norms, economic structures, political institutions, and even geological conditions all interact in ways that shape society. No single element can fully account for the trajectory of a civilization, as each influences and is influenced by the others. This dynamic interplay makes historical outcomes inherently unpredictable, resisting reductionist explanations. Given this complexity, Mosca advocates for a comparative approach to political science. Since the web of historical forces is too intricate to dissect in isolation, scholars must instead identify recurring patterns across different societies and eras. While direct one-on-one comparisons between past and present are impossible, given the uniqueness of each historical context, the study of political behavior reveals enduring tendencies. By examining how incentives, power structures, and social dynamics have manifested in different regimes, we can better understand contemporary politics. This method does not provide rigid laws but offers analytical tools to interpret political phenomena. Central to Mosca's framework is his conception of political classes, a universal feature of organized societies. In every polity, a minority ruling class monopolizes power. This duality persists regardless of a society's formal structure, be it democratic, feudal, socialist, or oligarchic. Even in systems that claim egalitarianism, organized minorities inevitably dominate disorganized majorities. Mosca emphasizes that no single ruler, whether a monarch or a modern president, can govern without the support of a broader elite that legitimizes and administers power. Thus, political organization always hinges on hierarchies, even when masked by democratic rhetoric. The structure of the ruling class further refines his analysis. Mosca distinguishes between a small core of high-ranking leaders and a larger secondary stratum of bureaucrats and officials who handle daily governance. The stability and effectiveness of a regime depend heavily on the secondary layer. As Mosca writes, deficiencies in morality or competence among lower-ranking elites pose a greater threat to the state than flaws in top leadership, since the bureaucracy sustains the system's operations. A ruling class that fails to cultivate capable administrators risks collapse, no matter how skilled its figureheads. Mosca contends that societies are defined by their ruling classes. The values, ambitions, and ideologies of elites permeate cultural, economic, and political life, shaping a society's spirit. To study a civilization is in essence to study its elites, their evolution, conflict, and adaptations. History, in this view, is best understood as a succession of dominant groups, each rising and falling as social conditions change. This leads to Mosca's notion of the struggle for preeminence, a concept echoing but not identical to social Darwinism. Unlike biological competition, where the weak perish, political struggle revolves around control of scarce resources, wealth, status, knowledge, and influence. Lower classes, though disadvantaged, do not vanish. Instead, they grow in number, even as their leverage diminishes. The ruling class, meanwhile, must constantly adapt to maintain power. Birthright alone cannot secure elite status. Members must refine their skills, act prudently, and respond to shifting social forces. These social forces evolve over time. Early elites derive power from military or religious authority, but modern complexities have introduced new forces, commerce, technology, scientific expertise, giving rise to capitalist and technocratic elites. A ruling class that ignores these shifts risks obsolescence, as seen in the decline of European aristocracies that failed to adapt to industrialization. Elites maintain dominance not just through force, but through political formulas, narratives that justify their rule. These ranges from medieval mandates of heaven to modern appeals to democracy and human rights. Mosca notes these are not mere cynical ploys. They answer a real need in man's social nature, to be governed on the basis of a moral principle. When formulas lose credibility, as with the divine right of kings in 1789 or neoliberal globalization in 2016, revolutions erupt. Yet new elites inevitably emerge, crafting new legitimizing myths. Mosca identifies two mechanisms for elite recruitment, the autocratic and liberal principle. These principles represent opposing currents in the circulation of elites. The autocratic principle operates as a top-down mechanism, when new members of the ruling class are drawn exclusively from within established elite circles. Medieval Europe epitomized the system with its rigid hierarchies maintained through noble bloodlines and hereditary succession. Conversely, the liberal principle functions as a bottom-up process, theoretically allowing talent to rise from lower social strata. Ancient Athens demonstrated this in its radical form, selecting officials by lottery among its citizenry. Though we must remember this democracy excluded 87% of the population. History rarely presents pure examples of either principle. More commonly, we find hybrid systems where one tendency dominates while incorporating elements of the other. The medieval Catholic Church, an authoritarian institution, practiced surprisingly liberal recruitment by elevating talented commoners through its ranks. Meanwhile, our modern representative democracies, while theoretically open to all, often see political dynasties and educated elites reproducing their privilege across generations. Ultimately, these competing principles represent not a solution to elite domination, but different methods of elite renewal. With the autocratic principle being the most stable over time and most common in human history, it can easily lead to stifling innovation and nepotism. While the liberal principle does not have these deficits and enables a fuller development of a society's potential, it is rather short-lived because it is too dynamic and can lead to demagoguery, which will inevitably lead back to the autocratic principle. As Burnham states, a revolutionary movement ordinarily proclaims that its aim is to do away with all privileges of birth, but invariably once it is in power, the aristocratic tendency reasserts itself, and a new ruling group crystallizes out from the revolution. Mosca critiques ideologies that promise absolute justice or utopian ideals. He warns that such aspirations are not only unattainable, but inherently dangerous. When political movements dedicate vast intellectual and moral energies to realizing an impossible ideal, they inevitably produce catastrophe. As Mosca observes, the pursuit of absolute justice leads not to a perfected society, but to the triumph of the worst individuals, those willing to exploit noble ideals for power, while leaving the well-intentioned disillusioned. Rather than chasing utopian fantasies, Mosca advocates for relative justice, a pragmatic balance achieved through well-ordered societies governed by constructive laws, norms, and customs. These structures vary across cultural and historical periods, but their essential function remains the same: to restrain personal ambitions in favor of the public good. Central to this concept is liberty, which Mosca defines within the framework of juridical defense, the respect for laws that check the excesses of power, wealth, and violence. True liberty emerges not from unrestrained freedom, but from the rule of law, ensuring that neither the ruling class nor the citizenry can dominate the other. Yet, as Burnham notes, laws and constitutions alone cannot guarantee juridical defense. Hitler never abolished the Weimar Constitution, and Stalin's Soviet Union operated under a supposedly democratic charter. Formal institutions are meaningless without a real balance of power among social forces. When one class monopolizes authority, whether in tyranny, oligarchy, or unchecked democracy, liberty erodes. Political equilibrium requires a dynamic tension between competing interests, preventing any single group from imposing its will absolutely. George Sorel, often misunderstood as a mere apostle of violence, was in fact a thinker who applied a Machiavellian methodology to political analysis. His rejection of so-called scientific socialism was not a dismissal of reason itself, but rather a critique of pseudo-scientific doctrines that served as ideological cover for power grabs. Like Machiavelli, Sorel recognized that politics is fundamentally about struggle, not abstract ideals, but the raw contest for control. As a syndicalist, Sorel opposed centralized state socialism, believing that any attempt to institutionalize revolution would merely replace one elite with another. Bureaucratic hierarchies, he argued, inevitably corrupt even the most idealistic movements, reproducing the very structures of domination they sought to overthrow. This skepticism led him to reject conventional socialist strategies, which relied on electoral politics or vanguardist leadership. Instead, he advocated for worker self-organization through revolutionary syndicates, direct, decentralized action that bypassed the state altogether. Sorel's most striking contribution was his theory of political myths. Unlike utopias or scientific hypotheses, which demanded rational verification, myths are unfalsifiable narratives that inspire action. They are not programs to be dissected, but forces that unify and energize. A successful myth, such as the early Christian belief in the immanent kingdom of God or the Jacobin vision of revolutionary triumph, addresses deep collective emotions, transforming passive observers into active participants. Sorel did not believe myths had to be true in a literal sense to be effective. The early Christians did not establish heaven on earth, nor did the French Revolution achieve perfect liberty. Yet both movements reshaped history. What mattered was the will to act that myths instilled. As he wrote, the myths are expressions of a determination to act, not speculative forecasts. This insight separated him from both utopian socialists and rigid Marxists, who treated socialism as an inevitable historical outcome. Sorel's most controversial ideas revolved around violence, not as senseless brutality, but as a necessary counterforce to institutionalized oppression. Writing in the early 20th century, when liberal optimism proclaimed the end of large-scale conflict. Modern capitalist societies, he observed, had not abolished coercion but disguised it. Instead of overt domination by king or warlords, oppression now operated through impersonal mechanisms. Economic exploitation, bureaucratic control, and ideological manipulation. The ruling class condemned physical violence while engaging in systemic fraud and financial exploitation. This hypocrisy, Sorel argued, led to social decay, when elites no longer ruled openly but instead masked their power behind humanitarian rhetoric. They eroded accountability. Reformist socialists, too, played into this dynamic, condemning revolutionary violence while using minor unrest as leverage in parliamentary bargaining, never pushing for real change. The result was a stagnant, corrupt order where oppression persisted under a veneer of civility. For Sorel, violence was not an end in itself, but a means of restoring political honesty. When linked to a powerful myth, such as the proletarian general strike, it could become a disciplined, purposeful force preventing degeneration into mere savagery. History showed that suppressed tensions, when denied an outlet, often exploded catastrophically, as in the French Revolution. By contrast, controlled, myth-driven conflict could serve as a corrective, forcing elites to reckon with popular demands rather than hiding behind procedural mechanisms. Robert Michels' seminal work, Political Parties, posits, all organizations, no matter how egalitarian their origins, inevitably develop oligarchic structures. This is not a cynical observation, but an empirical truth rooted in the mechanics of collective action itself. Michels begins with a fundamental question that most democratic theorists avoid. Can mass democracy actually function as promised? The answer emerges from examining real-world constraints rather than philosophical ideals. He posits three main problems. First, the scale problem. Even in ancient civilizations with much smaller populations and suffrage excluding restrictions of non-male, non-property owning people, it was physically impossible to fit all citizens into a single building, let alone to have a productive discussion on that scale. Second, the efficiency problem. Crises demand fast decision-making, not endless deliberation. When foreign armies invade or economies collapse, societies cannot wait for consensus to emerge. Third, the expertise problem. Should a farmer and a general have equal say on military strategy? Complex governance requires specialization, which concentrates knowledge and thus power. These realities lead to a strong conclusion. Delegation of authority is unavoidable, and with it comes the nature of oligarchy. Michels demonstrated this through his groundbreaking study of pre-World War I socialist parties, movements that promoted radical equality yet developed rigid hierarchies within years. Three mechanisms drive this transformation. Technical necessity. Complex organizations require professional administrators who inevitably control decision-making. Psychological dependence. Most people prefer to follow rather than lead, what Michels called the master's eternal tutelage. Resource monopolization. Bureaucrats control funds, information flows, and disciplinary tools, entrenching their power. The majority of human beings, Michels concluded, must be content to constitute the pedestal of an oligarchy. This was not a moral failing, but an organizational inevitability. Even revolutionary victories betrayed their ideals, as seen when socialist movements took power only to recreate the hierarchies they once opposed. Yet Michels' conclusion is not to do away with democracy, but instead argues that while perfect democracy may be unattainable, the struggle itself has value. Democracy is a treasure which no one will ever discover by deliberate search, he wrote. But in continuing our search, we shall perform a work which will have fertile results. This endless cycle of movements challenging oligarchy only to become new oligarchies is coined by Michels as the iron law of oligarchy. Pareto distinguishes between logical actions which are deliberate, goal-oriented, and based on rational means to achieve possible ends, for example a carpenter building a table, and non-logical actions which lack deliberate purpose, involve impossible goals, or employ inappropriate means, for example superstitious rituals or utopian pursuits. He argues that most human behavior, especially in social and political contexts, is non-logical. Building upon the logical-non-logical conduct distinction, Pareto's theory of residues and derivations provides a framework for understanding the unchanging instincts that drive human behavior and the shifting rationalizations we use to justify them. Residues are the stable, underlying motivations behind actions, while derivations are the superficial explanations we construct to make those actions appear logical or moral. Together they reveal why political ideologies, social movements, and cultural norms often fail to achieve their stated goals, because human behavior is rooted in instinct, not reason. Residues are not instincts themselves, but their observable manifestations in social behavior. Pareto likens them to constants in human nature, persistent across history and cultures, even if their expressions vary. He identifies 6 major classes of residues, with Class 1 combinations and Class 2 group persistence being the most politically significant. Class 1 Instinct for combinations. This residue drives innovation, manipulation, and experimentation with new ideas or social arrangements. In economics, it appears in speculators and inventors. In politics, in demagogues and reformers. In religion, in cult leaders and myth-makers. While this impulse fuels progress, it also leads to instability, financial bubbles, revolutions, and elite manipulation. Pareto associates it with fox-like cunning, where elites rule through persuasion rather than force. Class 2 Group persistence. Opposing the foxes are the lions, those driven by conservatism, tradition, and group loyalty. Nationalism, religious devotion, and family bonds exemplify this residue. It provides social cohesion but can also lead to stagnation, for example, Sparta's militarized rigidity or feudal resistance to change. When dominant, it maintains order but suppresses innovation. Class 3 Need for self-expression and activity. This residue explains actions taken for their own sake, regardless of purpose. Political rallies, superstitious rituals, or even busy work fall under this category. People act simply because they feel compelled to, not because of rational goals. Class 4 Sociality, conformity, and altruism. Humans crave social approval, leading to herd behavior, peer pressure, and altruistic acts, even when irrational. This residue underpins mass movements, where individuals conform to group norms rather than independent judgment. Class 5 Integrity of the individual, self-preservation. This instinct drives resistance to threats against one's status, property, or identity. Examples include middle-class opposition to radical wealth redistribution or personal vendettas disguised as justice. Class 6 Intercourse residue. Concerned with the social and biological dimension of intercourse, relationships, and desires. While residues are constant, derivations are the ever-changing rationalizations we invent to justify them. Pareto identifies 4 types. First, assertions, simple dogmas, bare claims without reasoning, for example, all men are created equal. Second, authority, appeals to tradition or leaders. Justifications citing sacred texts or historical figures, for example, the founding fathers intended. Third, accords with sentiment, abstract principles. Vague, emotionally appealing concepts like justice or progress. Fourth, verbal proofs, word games and fallacies. Persuasion through sophistry. For example, you can't criticize capitalism while using an iPhone. In matters of policy and state action, Pareto distinguishes between two types of social utility. The first dimension, the utility of the community, represents a society's survival strength. This is its capacity to endure external pressure like military threats or economic competition, while maintaining internal stability against forces of decay. Pareto examines several critical components of this survival utility: military preparedness that deters aggression, economic systems capable of withstanding shocks, demographic vitality ensuring future generations, and a cultural cohesion that binds a people together. History provides stark illustrations of this principle in action. Consider Sparta's legendary social order. Its ruthless militarization and discipline created one of the ancient world's most formidable states. But at what cost? The systematic suppression of individual freedoms and the brutal treatment of the helot population reveal the dark side of prioritizing pure survival strength. Similarly, Weimar Germany's fragmentation, its political polarization, economic instability, and social divisions demonstrates how internal weakness invites external threats and eventual collapse. The second dimension is the utility for the community. Here the focus shifts from collective survival to material flourishing. This encompasses the living standards that determine well-being, the freedoms that allow personal development, the equitable distribution of resources that foster social harmony, and the peaceful conditions that enable human happiness. Modern nations display this tension in vivid relief. Sweden's social democratic model, with its robust welfare state, progressive taxation, and strong labor protections, consciously prioritizes citizen welfare, even if this means higher taxes or limits on certain economic freedoms. At the opposite pole stands North Korea's totalitarian system, where the population endures severe deprivation and repression while the regime maintains an iron grip on power and diverts resources to military capabilities. What makes Pareto's framework so valuable is its recognition that these two utilities exist in permanent tension. The policies and institutions that strengthen a society's survival prospects often require sacrifices in individual welfare, whether through military conscription, economic austerity, or restrictions on personal freedoms. Conversely, societies that prioritize immediate well-being and personal liberties may inadvertently weaken their long-term resilience. This isn't merely an academic distinction, but a practical dilemma facing every government. Should a nation invest in military power or healthcare? Should it prioritize economic growth or income inequality? Should it enforce social cohesion or protect individual rights? An objective political science must therefore reject ideological wishful thinking and integrate the discernible patterns of political history discussed. Unlike Marxism's class-bound dogmas or liberalism's faith in progress, this method treats power as a neutral fact, analyzing elites and institutions with the detachment of a physicist studying gravity. Words, programs, declarations, Burnham warns, must be related to the whole complex of social facts to understand their real political meaning. Machiavellian science anticipates revolution when elites grow decadent or liberty's erosion when states centralize power.